were standing in a field, roughly 5,000 years ago, in what is now eastern Turkey. In your hand is a rock. It's sharp. You spent an hour chipping it into a point, and it is, without question, the best weapon you have ever owned. The man standing across from you is holding something you have never seen in your life. It's long, thin, metallic. It catches the sunlight in a way stone never does, never can. You don't know what it's made of. You don't know how it was shaped. But your body understands something your mind hasn't caught up to yet. That object can reach you before yours can reach him. And if the two collide, only one of them is going to shatter. That single moment, stone meeting metal for the first time, is one of the most consequential collisions in the entire history of human violence. And it didn't start because someone wanted a better way to kill. It started because someone, somewhere, figured out how to melt a rock. So how did we get from a sharpened stone to a folded steel blade, capable of cutting through 20 sheets of paper after 25 centuries in the ground? The answer runs across 5,000 years, 3 continents, and at least 4 completely independent traditions of people who never met each other, solving the exact same problem in wildly different ways. Let's start with why the sword had to wait 2.5 million years to be born. For nearly the entire span of human existence, every cutting tool we ever made came from stone. And here's the part that should genuinely surprise you. Stone tools were not primitive. They were, in some respects, better than anything metal would produce for thousands of years afterward. Obsidian, volcanic glass, can be fractured into an edge only a few nanometers thick. A modern surgical scalpel made of steel has an edge roughly 10,000 times thicker than that. Under an electron microscope, a steel blade looks like a jagged mountain range. An obsidian blade looks like a single, unbroken line. Surgeons have actually used obsidian scalpels in modern operating rooms because they slice between cells instead of tearing through them. So if stone was that sharp, why did anyone bother inventing something else? Because stone has exactly one fatal flaw, and it is not a small one. It is brittle. You can sharpen it into something extraordinary, but you cannot make it long and thin without it snapping in your hand. A stone dagger works. A stone sword is not just difficult. It is physically impossible. The material itself refuses. And in a fight, whoever has the longer weapon controls the distance, and whoever controls the distance usually goes home. For 2.5 million years, nobody could solve that problem, because it wasn't a problem of skill, it was a problem of physics. Metal said yes to a question stone could only ever say no to. Around 9,000 years ago, people across the Near East began finding native copper, metal that occurs naturally in pure form near the surface of the earth, and hammering it into shape. It was mostly ornaments at first. Copper was soft, too soft to hold a real edge, too soft to trust your life to. But it had one property no stone ever had. You could melt it, pour it, and cast it into a shape that had never existed before. Then someone mixed it with arsenic, almost certainly by accident, and the resulting alloy came out harder, sharper, capable of being cast into blades longer and thinner than pure copper could ever manage. This is where the story gets its first genuine shock. In the early 1980s, archaeologist Marcela Frangipane was excavating a mound called Arslantepe in eastern Turkey. Inside a collapsed palace complex, her team uncovered 9 weapons, 3 short swords and 6 long daggers, cast in arsenical copper, complete with blades, guards, grips, and pommels. 3 were inlaid with silver. These were not crude prototypes. These were finished, deliberate, high-status weapons. They are roughly 5,300 years old. Before this discovery, historians placed the invention of the sword nearly 2,000 years later. One excavation rewrote the opening chapter of an entire category of human technology. But arsenical copper had a problem waiting for it. It bent. And a sword that bends in the middle of a fight is not a sword. It's a countdown. The fix arrived when someone mixed copper with roughly 10% tin. The result, bronze, was significantly harder, held an edge, and could be cast into long blades that didn't fold the first time they struck something solid. Bronze is the material that turned the sword from a rich man's ornament into an actual weapon. Picture the Egyptian khopesh, that unmistakable forward-curving blade, evolved out of earlier sickle swords and crescent battle axes, reaching its peak during the New Kingdom. That hook wasn't decoration. It could snag an opponent's shield and yank it aside, opening a gap for the killing stroke, devastating from a moving chariot. 2 of them were buried with Tutankhamun, not as decoration, as a declaration of power meant to last into the next world. But bronze came with a hidden dependency, and this is where the story of the sword quietly becomes the story of the ancient world's first global supply chain. Bronze needs tin. Copper was everywhere. Tin was almost nowhere, concentrated in a handful of locations, including Afghanistan, Central Asia, and, remarkably, Cornwall, in what is now southwestern England. Modern isotope analysis has confirmed that Cornish tin was reaching the Mediterranean as early as the 2nd millennium BCE. Somewhere around 3,000 years ago, a supply line stretched from tin mines in England to bronze forges on the far side of Europe, for one purpose: swords. In 1982, divers found a merchant ship that had sunk off the Turkish coast in the 14th century BCE. The Oberon wreck was carrying copper and tin ingots, glass, luxury trade goods, and 2 Mycenaean bronze swords, sitting in the same hull as the raw materials that had made them. One shipwreck told archaeologists more about how tightly connected the ancient world actually was than decades of digging on land ever had. And then, around 1200 BCE, that entire system came apart. Drought, political collapse, mysterious raiders historians still argue about, known only as the Sea Peoples. When the tin trade routes were severed, bronze production collapsed with them, and when bronze collapsed, so did the military power built on it. One broken supply chain, and an entire age of warfare ended. Here's the part almost everyone gets backward about what happened next. Iron did not replace bronze because iron was better. Early iron was often worse, softer, harder to work, quick to rust. Iron replaced bronze because it didn't need a shipping route from England. Iron ore sits in the ground almost everywhere on Earth. You didn't need to be rich, connected, or lucky to get your hands on it. You just needed a hillside. That single fact quietly rewrote the shape of war itself. During the Bronze Age, swords belonged to an elite, men who could afford rare materials and skilled smiths, while everyone else fought with sharpened wood and stone. Iron erased that barrier. When the raw material for a weapon is sitting behind your own village, suddenly everyone can be armed. Armies stopped being small groups of expensive champions and became vast blocks of ordinary men carrying ordinary blades. Not because the weapon improved, because the number of people who could carry one exploded. Before we leave iron behind, one detour, because it might be the strangest weapon ever pulled from a body. In 1925, inside the wrappings of Tutankhamun's mummy, Howard Carter found 2 daggers, one gold, one iron. Decades later, X-ray analysis revealed the iron blade contained the exact chemical signature of a meteorite that had struck near Mersa Matruh. The ancient Egyptians had a name for that metal, iron of the sky. They took a rock that fell out of the heavens and forged it into a weapon for a dead king. 3,300 years of human ambition compressed into a single dagger. Iron alone still wasn't the final answer, though. It was too soft. Add a small amount of carbon, and iron becomes steel, hard enough to hold an edge, flexible enough not to snap. The only question left was how, exactly, you got the carbon in. India answered first. Sometime in the mid-1st millennium BCE, metal workers in southern India packed iron ore with carbon-rich material inside sealed clay crucibles and heated the mixture past 1,200 degrees Celsius. What came out was an unusually high carbon steel with an internal crystalline structure that, forged correctly, produced visible flowing patterns on the finished blade. The word for this steel traveled along trade routes to Persia and Syria, where local smiths turned it into weapons the West would eventually name after the marketplace where they first saw them: Damascus steel. The name has almost nothing to do with where the steel was actually born. Alexander the Great reportedly carried 10 kilograms of this Indian steel home from his campaigns, stunned by it. Centuries later, the physicist Michael Faraday studied samples of it in his own laboratory, a failed attempt to reverse engineer an ancient sword that ended up helping found the modern science of materials. Somewhere, an ancient Indian blacksmith accidentally contributed to the birth of materials science, without ever knowing it. On the other side of the world, China was solving the identical problem through an entirely different route. In 1965, archaeologists opened a sealed wooden casket in a tomb in Hubei province and found a bronze sword belonging to Guzhan, king of Yu, who ruled in the 5th century BCE. The blade was over 2,500 years old. It was untarnished. It sliced cleanly through 20 sheets of paper on the first try. The secret was a bimetallic design, a flexible copper-rich core wrapped in a harder, tin-rich cutting edge, 2 different alloys doing 2 different jobs inside one weapon. 2,500 years ago, someone had already figured out composite engineering, without a word for it. Back in Europe, Rome answered the same question, not with a new metal, but with a new philosophy. The Roman gladius was short, barely over 60 centimeters, almost comically small next to the long, sweeping Celtic blades it regularly defeated in battle. And that's the twist. It won not despite being short, but because of it. The gladius wasn't built for a lone warrior swinging freely. It was built for a wall of men standing shoulder to shoulder, so close you could feel the man beside you breathing, where a long slashing sword had no room to move at all. What you needed in that crush was a short, fast blade you could punch past the edge of your shield into the man directly in front of you. Rome, fittingly, had borrowed the entire concept from the very Iberian warriors it would later conquer. But even Rome's perfect weapon had an expiration date. By the 3rd century, wars had shifted toward cavalry and looser, faster engagements, and the short gladius started losing its advantage. So Rome adopted the spatha, longer, borrowed this time from the Celtic and Germanic peoples it had spent centuries fighting. That spatha became the direct ancestor of nearly every medieval European sword that followed: Viking, Norman, Crusader. All of them, in a sense, descendants of a design Rome once fought against and eventually decided to steal. In Japan, smiths answered the same hardness versus toughness problem with what might be the most labor-intensive blade-making process ever devised. Katana steel, called tamahagane, came out of clay furnaces with wildly uneven carbon content and impurities baked in. The famous folding technique wasn't mysticism. It was damage control. Folding evened out the carbon, pushed out the slag, and built the layered grain visible in the finished steel. Then came differential hardening. A thick coat of clay along the spine, a thin coat along the edge, quenched together in water. The edge cooled fast and turned hard. The spine cooled slowly and stayed flexible enough to absorb a shock without snapping. The visible boundary between those two zones, the hamon, became one of the most admired lines ever etched into metal, a scar from the process, turned into art. Meanwhile, Vikings were carrying swords stamped with a single word: VLFBERHT. These blades, made between the 9th and 11th centuries from remarkably pure crucible steel that Europe's own furnaces couldn't yet produce, almost certainly traveled in from Central Asia, along river trade routes stretching toward the Caspian Sea. Ulfbert wasn't one smith's name. It was a brand, a mark of quality stamped across generations of workshops. And where there's a valuable brand, there are counterfeits. Fakes made from inferior local iron circulated too, brittle enough to shatter mid-swing, killing the very man who'd paid for quality and gotten a gamble instead. 1,000 years later, metallurgists can still tell real from fake, sometimes just from a misspelling stamped into the steel. Now, a few things pop culture gets completely wrong. Medieval swords were not heavy. A standard one-handed blade weighed roughly as much as a laptop, not a sledgehammer. Fighting manuals from masters like Lichtenauer and Fiore de Liberi describe precise, named techniques: footwork, counters, even gripping your own blade to guide the point into a gap in plate armor. This was a discipline, not a brawl. And that groove running down so many blades, the one everyone calls a blood groove, it has nothing to do with blood. It's called a fuller, and it does exactly what the groove in an I-beam does in a skyscraper: removes weight without sacrificing strength. Someone had invented structural engineering, and simply never bothered to name it. And then, slowly, the sword died. Not in a single moment, the same way almost every dominant technology dies. Not replaced all at once, but slowly out-argued by a changing world. Plate armor got good enough that cutting swords became nearly useless against it, so smiths built rigid thrusting blades just to punch through the gaps. Then came massed pike formations, walls of men holding spears 15 feet long, against which a sword was a liability, not an asset. Then, in the late 17th century, the bayonet turned every musket into a spear, and just like that, there was no longer any reason to carry a dedicated blade into an infantry line at all. George S. Patton, decades before he became famous commanding tanks across Europe, designed what might be the last serious military sword ever built, a thrusting cavalry saber, engineered on the belief that stabbing, not slashing, was the sword's only remaining path to relevance. The same man would later abandon horses entirely for armored vehicles. That, in one biography, is the entire arc of the sword's 20th century. And yet, on August 23, 1942, roughly 600 Italian cavalrymen charged Soviet infantry positions, armed with machine guns and mortars, carrying sabers. They won, in 1942, swords against automatic weapons, one final time, in a world that had already moved on completely. In June 2023, archaeologists in Bavaria pulled a bronze sword from a burial containing a man, a woman, and a boy. It was roughly 3,000 years old. Officials who examined it said it still shines. It showed no signs of ever having been used in a fight, but its balance confirmed it was a real weapon, not a ceremonial one. 3,000 years underground, and it was, in some strange and literal sense, still ready. Tonight, somewhere, a sword is hanging on a wall, behind museum glass, in a private collection, or folded into a dress uniform, carried now for tradition instead of threat. It doesn't cut anything anymore. It doesn't need to. But the problem it was built to solve, how to strike farther than your own arm can reach, how to hold an edge without losing your flexibility, how to make hardness and toughness live inside the same piece of metal. That problem shaped chemistry, global trade, martial arts, structural engineering, and the political architecture of nearly every civilization that ever picked one up. A sword is a piece of bent metal. It is also 5,000 years of human ingenuity, folded, hammered, and quenched into something you can hold in one hand. And the people who made the first one, in a palace workshop in eastern Turkey, shaping arsenical copper into something the world had never seen before, they had no idea what they were starting. They only knew one simple thing: stone breaks, metal bends, and the person holding the longer blade is the one who walks home.